The sun was high in the sky, casting a warm golden light through the church's stained glass windows. The colorful glass transformed the sunlight into a beautiful, sparkling display, painting the wooden pews in hues of red, blue, and green. It was a peaceful, serene moment, but there was a sense of quiet anticipation in the air. The guests sat in their places, murmuring softly as they adjusted their clothes and glanced toward the entrance. The soft hum of conversation was interrupted only by the occasional rustle of fabric as people settled into their seats. Everyone in the church could feel the tension, the excitement, and the nerves of what was to come. A wedding was a momentous occasion, and everyone knew that this particular wedding was no exception. Father Rowan stood at the altar, his hands folded in front of him. He looked over the gathering of friends and family, his eyes trained on the faces of the guests, observing them with a practiced gaze. He had been a priest for many years, and in that time he had officiated countless weddings. Some had been full of joy and celebration, while others had been more practical, more subdued. There were weddings where the couple was deeply in love, and then there were those where the bond was not so clear, where love had become uncertain or even fragile. But today, Father Rowan felt something different in the air. There was something in the room that he couldn't quite name, something that made him uneasy, something he could not ignore. Dorian, the groom, stood beside Father Rowan at the altar. He was a tall, handsome man dressed in a perfectly tailored suit. His expression was a mixture of happiness and nervousness, a look that came from being deeply in love but also understanding the gravity of the moment. His fingers fidgeted with the cuffs of his crisp white shirt, an unconscious gesture that betrayed his nerves. He smiled at a friend who leaned in and whispered something encouraging, but Father Rowan noticed that Dorian's smile didn't quite reach his eyes. There was a flicker of tension in his face, a subtle unease that made the priest wonder what was going through his mind. Dorian's eyes darted toward the doors of the church, waiting for the woman he would soon marry to appear. The church was almost full. Friends, family, and distant relatives filled the rows, all eager to witness the ceremony. There was quiet laughter, murmurs of excitement, and the occasional rustling of fabric as people adjusted their seating. The air was filled with the light-hearted atmosphere of a celebration, but there was an undercurrent of something deeper, something more restrained. At the front of the church, sitting with perfect posture, were Dorian's parents, Silas and Vespera. Their presence was commanding, their expressions unreadable. Silas sat with his hands folded across his lap, his gaze fixed ahead, his face set in a stern expression. Vespera sat beside him, her lips pressed tightly together, betraying nothing of her thoughts. Unlike the other guests who whispered and turned toward the entrance with eager anticipation, Silas and Vespera did not look in that direction, as if they were unaffected by the arrival of the bride. And then the music began. The soft, beautiful sound of strings filled the church, and the noise from the guests faded away. A hush fell over the crowd as the doors at the far end of the church slowly opened. Everyone turned their heads in unison, and all eyes were drawn to the woman standing at the threshold. It was Elowen, the bride. She stepped into the church, and the room seemed to exhale collectively. She was radiant, her dress simple yet elegant, flowing effortlessly around her as she moved. Her bouquet was delicately held in her hands, and the veil that framed her face added an air of mystery and grace. Even through the soft lace, her beauty was undeniable. The guests gasped, some with admiration, some with a sense of awe. She was the picture of perfection, and for a moment, it seemed like the entire church was enchanted by her presence. But Father Rowan, standing at the altar, did not focus on the admiration sweeping through the church. He wasn't watching the guests' expressions, nor was he lost in the beauty of the bride. His eyes were fixed on something else. The first thing he noticed was the silence. At most weddings, the entrance of the bride was met with hushed whispers, a collective sigh of approval, or the sound of people shifting in their seats to get a better look. But this silence was different. It was sharp, almost unnatural. It wasn't the gentle quiet that usually filled the room, but something more tense, more expectant. Father Rowan's heart skipped a beat, and he realized that something was not quite right. As Elowen walked down the aisle, he noticed the looks from some of the guests. Not from Dorian, whose face was open with love and anticipation, but from others in the crowd. There were two older guests sitting in the second row. They whispered to each other, their words hidden, but their disapproving expressions were clear. A younger woman, sitting a few rows back, pursed her lips and looked away as if embarrassed by something she was witnessing. And then there were Dorian's parents. Silas remained still, his features chiseled like stone. Vespera's fingers twitched where they rested on her lap, the only sign of movement, but it spoke volumes. Her eyes did not soften as Elowen neared the altar. There was no warmth, no welcoming gaze. Instead, there was something else, something colder, something more distant. Father Rowan's heart tightened in his chest. It wasn't sadness he saw in their eyes. It wasn't skepticism or protectiveness either. No, it was rejection. Pure, unspoken rejection. Elowen continued her walk down the aisle, her smile gentle but controlled, her every movement graceful, though there was an unmistakable stiffness beneath the elegance. Father Rowan could see it. Her grip on the bouquet was firm, almost too firm, as if she were holding on to something for support. Her shoulders were tight, and there was a weight in the air around her that wasn't just nerves. It was something deeper, something she was trying to hold back. She wasn't nervous in the usual way brides were. She was bracing herself. As she reached the altar, Father Rowan understood. This wasn't just a new chapter in her life. This was the weight of being unwelcome by the people who should have supported her, the people who should have been there to celebrate her joy. When Elowen stopped in front of Dorian, he reached out for her hands, and the moment their fingers touched, something seemed to ease in her. The tension in her shoulders melted just slightly, and she looked at him with warmth and love. There was a softness in her expression, a tenderness that told Father Rowan that despite everything, Elowen loved Dorian. But there was something else in the room, something that Father Rowan could not ignore. There were forces in the church, silent and powerful, that were determined to tear this union apart. He didn't know how yet, but he knew that before the ceremony was over, something would go terribly wrong. As Elowen stood beside Dorian, the church grew silent again. This wasn't the peaceful silence of a wedding ceremony, filled with the quiet anticipation of vows being exchanged. No, this silence was heavy, strained. It felt like the air had thickened with the unspoken thoughts of the guests. Father Rowan had stood at the altar countless times, officiating weddings where the couples were nervous or joyful or full of excitement. But there was something different about Elowen. It wasn't just the nervousness or the joy of a bride. There was something else there, something harder to see but impossible to ignore. She was poised, yes, but there was an unmistakable tension in her movements. It was in the way she held her bouquet, not as an accessory but as something to anchor her. It was in the way she stood, her body rigid, like she was preparing herself for something she could not control. Father Rowan looked beyond the couple to the faces of the guests. Most of them were smiling, their expressions warm with the significance of the day. Friends of the bride and groom were full of joy, their faces glowing with happiness. But not everyone was smiling. A few guests sat stiffly, their faces cold and unmoving. A woman in a pastel dress whispered something to her husband, who shook his head, his disapproval clear. A man in the third row, likely a distant relative, crossed his arms tightly over his chest, his face tight with judgment. These were not expressions of indifference or unfamiliarity. These were expressions of silent judgment, of disapproval. And then Father Rowan's gaze fell upon Silas and Vespera. Neither of them smiled. Neither of them looked like they were about to witness the beautiful moment of their son pledging his life to another. Silas's hands remained folded in his lap, his face set in stone. Vespera's fingers clenched so tightly that her knuckles turned white. It was not sadness that filled their faces. It wasn't quiet contemplation. It was rejection. They did not see Elowen as part of their family. Father Rowan understood now. Elowen had known from the very beginning that she was not welcomed by Dorian's parents. It explained the way she held herself, the way she measured each step she took, the way she braced herself when her eyes met the front row. She had entered this church knowing that she wasn't wanted by the people who should have been her family, who should have been celebrating this day with her. Father Rowan had seen difficult weddings before. He had seen feuding families, ex-lovers objecting at the last moment, even doubts about compatibility. But this was different. This wasn't just disagreement or sadness, it was something deeper. It was prejudice disguised as civility. It was intolerance, masked as concern. And standing in the center of it all was Elowen, trying her best to ignore the cold rejection and focus on the man she loved. As the ceremony continued, Father Rowan's stomach tightened with unease. He knew he could not proceed without ensuring that Elowen was stepping into this marriage freely, without hesitation and without fear. He needed to be sure that she was not being pressured, that she was marrying Dorian because she truly wanted to, despite the coldness that surrounded her. Suddenly, just as if the weight of Father Rowan's thoughts had aligned with fate, he saw Silas move. The older man rose from his seat without a word, his eyes fixed ahead, and began walking toward the altar. The movement sent a ripple through the guests. Heads turned, and murmurs filled the room, growing louder by the second. Vespera didn't try to stop him. She merely watched him, her hands still tightly clenched in her lap, as if she had expected this moment all along. Elowen went still. Father Rowan's eyes flicked to Dorian, who was staring at his father in confusion. The tension in the air had thickened, and it was no longer subtle. Silas stood still just before the altar, his expression unwavering. His voice rang out clearly, calm but with a sharpness that caught everyone's attention. "This wedding cannot continue," he said, his words filling the church like thunder. For a moment, it felt as if time itself had frozen. The room fell into a heavy silence, as though the air had thickened, pressing down on everyone with an unbearable weight. All eyes turned to Silas, waiting for an explanation, but no one dared to speak. Elowen's breath caught in her throat, and she instinctively tightened her grip on the bouquet she was holding, as though it were the only thing keeping her grounded in the whirlwind of confusion that surrounded her. Her heart raced in her chest, but she made no other movement, her face pale and still. She couldn't comprehend what was happening. Was this some sort of mistake? Surely this was all some kind of misunderstanding. Beside her, Dorian, the groom, stood frozen as well. His eyes were wide, and his body stiffened as he tried to process the weight of his father's words. It was as though his father's voice had cast a shadow over him, one that was too heavy to escape. Silas's words hung in the air like an unspoken verdict, and the entire congregation seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the next move. Father Rowan, who had been there to guide them through the ceremony, stood at the altar, his hands clasped together. He looked from Silas to Elowen, trying to make sense of what was unfolding before him. Silas's stance was firm, his gaze steady. He wasn't looking at anyone except the priest, as if the rest of the guests were invisible to him. The silence that had followed Silas's declaration felt like an eternity. The murmur of voices began to swell like a rising tide, whispers flowing between the pews, their sound carrying through the air like an approaching storm. The guests exchanged nervous glances, some with confusion, others with apprehension. What was happening? What had gone wrong? It was Dorian who finally moved first. His hands clenched into fists at his sides, and his jaw tightened as he turned to face his father. He was no longer the calm, poised man who had walked into the church just minutes before. Now his face was a mixture of disbelief and anger. "What do you mean? This is absurd," Dorian said, his voice shaking with a mix of fury and hurt. "Where is this coming from, Father?" But Silas didn't look at him. His eyes remained locked on Father Rowan, his expression as cold and steady as ever. He raised a hand, silencing his son without even a glance. "This wedding cannot continue," Silas repeated, his tone unwavering. Each word was deliberate, measured, as though he had carefully prepared this moment in advance. There was no hesitation, no doubt in his voice. Father Rowan took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. He had witnessed many weddings in his time, some joyful, others filled with tension, but never had he been faced with a situation like this. "Silas," he said cautiously, his voice calm but firm, "this is a serious claim. I cannot halt a ceremony without understanding why you feel this way. You must explain." For the briefest of moments, Silas's gaze faltered, but it was only for a fraction of a second. He seemed to gather himself before speaking again, his voice cutting through the tension in the room. "I have reason to believe that Elowen's intentions in this marriage are not honest," he said. His words were calm, calculated. "I believe she is not marrying my son for love, but for financial security." A collective gasp echoed through the room. It was as if the air had been sucked out of the church, and a cold chill ran down everyone's spine. Elowen's face drained of color, her breath catching in her throat. She stared at Silas, unable to comprehend what she was hearing. How could he say something so terrible? How could he accuse her of such a thing? She wanted to speak, to defend herself, but no words came. Dorian's face turned red with anger, his fists clenched at his sides as his voice rose. "That's ridiculous," he shouted. "Where is this coming from, Father? How can you believe this?" His words were sharp, filled with outrage and disbelief. But Silas, unmoved by his son's anger, continued to address Father Rowan, his gaze never leaving the priest. "We have had Elowen's background investigated," Silas said, his voice still steady, though the words felt like daggers. My wife and I have taken precautions. We've seen evidence of her family's financial troubles. They are not stable. My son has worked hard for his career, for his future, and I will not let him throw it away on someone who is only looking for a way out of her own troubles." Another murmur swept through the room, this one more urgent, as people exchanged looks of disbelief and confusion. Father Rowan's frown deepened. He had dealt with difficult families before, disapproving parents, feuding relatives, but there was something unsettling about Silas's demeanor. He spoke as if this wasn't a sudden outburst, but a well-prepared intervention. Silas pressed on. "My son deserves someone who is on equal footing with him. He has worked hard to get where he is, and I will not allow him to marry someone who will drag him down." "That's enough!" Dorian's voice cut through the growing murmur. His anger was now palpable, and he turned to face his father, his body trembling with rage. "Enough of this," he shouted. His face was a storm of emotions, hurt, betrayal, and fury all mixed together. Elowen remained still, her fingers trembling ever so slightly as she clutched her bouquet. She didn't speak. She didn't cry out. She only stood there, her face a mask of composure, though inside she felt as if everything was falling apart. Father Rowan looked to Elowen, his gaze softening. He knew that a moment like this could shatter someone. He asked her, his voice gentle, "Elowen, do you have anything you'd like to say?" She inhaled deeply, lifting her chin in defiance. "I didn't come here to prove my worth," she said clearly, her voice unwavering. "I came here to marry the man I love. If that isn't enough for you, then nothing I say will change your mind." Her words rang out with sincerity, and Father Rowan could hear the honesty in them. The room fell into silence again, and Father Rowan studied Elowen carefully. He had been a priest long enough to know when someone was being truthful, when someone was speaking from the heart. He had no doubt in his mind that Elowin loved Dorian, but before he could respond, another voice broke the silence. "I told you this would happen." Vespera, Dorian's mother, spoke up, her voice cold and controlled. She had remained seated through everything up until now, but her words were sharp. "We should have stopped this long ago." All eyes turned to her. She rose slowly from her seat, her face unreadable, but her eyes heavy with meaning. "She will never belong in our family," Vespera said, her words cutting through the air like a knife. Father Rowan's heart sank. He could feel the weight of those words settle over the room, thick and suffocating. It wasn't just about money. It wasn't just about security. It had always been about something much darker, something much more painful. The truth that had been hidden beneath the surface for so long was now exposed. Elowin stood tall, but she could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on her. The silence that followed was deafening, louder than any words that could have been spoken. Silas remained still, his face unreadable. Elowin stood at the front of the church, her posture perfect, her dress elegantly flowing as she smoothed the fabric with deliberate care. She made sure she appeared just as she always did, calm, graceful, composed, almost like a painting of dignity. Yet there was something different in her eyes, something sharp and unwavering. Her voice cut through the air as she spoke. "You may twist our words however you wish," she said, her tone clear, almost like a warning, "but this marriage is a mistake. It is a mistake, and if Dorian is too blinded by his infatuation to see that, then we must be the ones to open his eyes." Father Rowan felt a tightness in his chest, his heart pounding as he glanced around the room. The eyes of every guest were on him, their gazes heavy with expectation, waiting for his response. He had guided many couples through this exact moment, counseling them before they made their vows, urging them to carefully consider their love and their readiness for the trials that marriage would bring. He had always been the steady hand, the voice of wisdom, offering support and clarity when doubts arose. But this was different. This was not a typical wedding. He had never before been asked to defend the right of a couple to marry. Never had he been put in a position where love itself seemed to be under attack. His next words would set the course for what came next. They would shape the future for both Dorian and Elowin, and Father Rowan knew he had to be careful with each word he spoke. He turned to Dorian, the man standing just beside Elowin, looking unsure, nervous, his hands clenched by his sides. "You've heard what has been said," Father Rowan said, his voice calm but firm, his eyes locking onto Dorian with a steady gaze. "This is an important moment. I need to ask you, are you sure? Is this the life you really want?" Elowin's breath hitched ever so slightly, her fingers tightening around her bouquet. She looked at Dorian, her face unreadable, but there was a sense of expectancy in her eyes, a quiet yearning for him to answer. Seconds passed, and Dorian said nothing. His gaze flickered between Elowin and the people who had raised him, the ones who had shaped him into the man he was today. Father Rowan could feel the tension building in the room, could sense the weight of everyone's eyes pressing down on Dorian. It was like a battle was unfolding inside him, a war between love and loyalty, between the life he had always known and the life he might have with Elowin. And in that moment, Father Rowan saw it, the doubt, the hesitation. It was all there, plain to see. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, Dorian spoke. "I love her," he said, his voice soft, barely above a whisper. The words were clear, simple, but they carried with them the weight of something much deeper. For just a moment, Elowin's face softened, a brief flicker of relief passing through her eyes. But then Dorian's expression changed. His gaze fell to the floor, his shoulders slumping slightly. "But I don't know if I can do this." A wave of murmurs rippled through the church. People shifted in their seats, exchanged nervous glances, and whispered amongst themselves. Elowen's grip on her bouquet loosened, her shoulders slumping ever so slightly. It was barely noticeable, but Father Rowan saw it, and in that moment he understood. She had expected this, had known that Dorian's love, while deep, might not be enough to break the chains that bound him to his family and their expectations. Dorian turned toward his parents, his hands still clenched at his sides, his jaw set. His voice trembled as he spoke again. "I want to be with her," he said, his words shaky, "but I don't want to lose you." Silas, Dorian's father, stood with his arms crossed, his face unreadable, his posture stiff and rigid. Vespera, Dorian's mother, however, couldn't hide the smallest hint of satisfaction in the corners of her mouth. She looked at Elowen with a mixture of pity and triumph, as if this moment had been a long time coming, as if she had expected it all along. Elowen's lips parted, as if she wanted to say something, but no words came. Father Rowan closed his eyes for a brief second. This was what he had feared. Dorian had come here believing that love alone was enough, but now, faced with the reality of what it would cost him to be with Elowen, he was hesitating. That hesitation, that doubt, it was a crack in the foundation of everything he had believed in. Father Rowan straightened his back and inhaled slowly. He could not rush this moment, but one thing was clear to him. This wedding could not move forward, not yet. The silence in the church had changed. It was no longer the hushed quiet of reverence that usually filled such a sacred space. This silence was different. It was thick with tension, with uncertainty, as if something had shifted in the air, something that no one quite knew how to name. The room was still, and yet the air felt heavy, oppressive. It was the kind of silence that follows a revelation, a truth so powerful that no one knows how to react. It was the silence that comes when love and duty collide and no one is willing to take the next step forward. Father Rowan surveyed the faces in front of him. He had officiated countless weddings in this very church. He had seen couples nervous but excited, eager to begin their lives together. But never had he seen a moment like this. Never had he seen a couple, a family, at such a crossroads. A moment where the very foundation of a marriage was being torn apart before it had even begun. Dorian stood rigid, his fists clenched at his sides, his eyes darting between Elowen and his parents. He was caught, stuck in an invisible battle, torn between the woman he loved and the family that had raised him. His words hung in the air, unresolved, like the final notes of a song that had ended too soon. "I want to be with her," he said again, his voice breaking, "but I don't want to lose you." Elowen had not moved. She stood in place, still and poised, her hands gently holding her bouquet. But there was something different now. Something harder in the way she carried herself. The tension that had been in her body before had settled into something colder, sharper. It wasn't anger, no, not that, but something more difficult to explain. It was understanding, the quiet kind of understanding that comes from years of knowing the truth, even when it's not spoken out loud. Father Rowan knew this moment had to come to an end, but he also knew it couldn't continue in this state of uncertainty. The ceremony had to move forward, one way or another. He stepped forward again, his voice cutting through the silence like a beacon. "Marriage," he said, his voice firm but steady, "is not simply an agreement between two people. It is a union that must be built on trust, on love, and on a willingness to stand together no matter the cost." He looked at Dorian, then at Elowen. "I have asked you both if you are certain of your commitment to one another, but commitment is not merely a promise spoken in front of witnesses. It is a choice that must be made not just today, but every day that follows." Elowen met his gaze, and for the first time, Father Rowan saw something in her eyes that he hadn't seen before. It was a quiet, weary gratitude. She had waited so long for this moment, for some kind of sign, and now she was seeing the truth that had always been there. Dorian was still torn, still held by the pull of family, still unsure. Father Rowan took a deep breath and looked directly at Dorian. Do you take Elowen to be your wife, to stand beside her, to love her, and to choose her above all else?" The room held its breath. No one moved. No one spoke. The question hung in the air like an open door, waiting for Dorian to walk through it. Dorian hesitated. It was brief, but it was enough. A moment of doubt, a moment of uncertainty. Father Rowan saw it, and so did Elowen. That brief glance Dorian gave to his parents, the way his eyes flickered for just an instant, told her everything she needed to know. She had known it all along, deep down. She had known that Dorian wasn't ready to fully let go of the life he had always known. With a soft, resigned sigh, Elowen lowered her bouquet, her fingers trembling slightly. Slowly, she turned, not toward Dorian, but toward his parents. The room seemed to hold its breath, everyone watching her, waiting for what would come next. "I have spent so much time wondering if I would ever be enough for you," Elowen said quietly, her voice carrying across the church with the weight of years of unspoken pain. "I have asked myself if there was anything I could do, anything I could say, that would make you see me as more than the thing you refuse to accept." She took a step closer to Silas and Vespera, her heels clicking softly against the stone floor. "But I understand now that it was never about me. It was about you, about what you refuse to let go of, about what you fear losing if you open your world to something different." Vespera's lips parted ever so slightly as if she was about to speak, but no words came. Elowen's gaze did not falter. "I will not spend my life fighting for a place in a family that has already decided it does not want me," she continued, her voice steady, though there was a trace of sadness in it. "I love your son," she said, her voice softening, "but I love myself too." With that, Elowen turned toward Dorian. For a long moment, they simply looked at each other. There was no anger, no hatred, no bitterness, just a quiet sadness, the kind that comes when you realize something that can never be undone. Dorian opened his mouth to speak, but no words came. He stood frozen, lost, his face a mixture of confusion and regret. Then Elowen gently stepped back, placing her bouquet on the altar. Slowly, deliberately, she turned and walked away. The silence that followed was deafening. No one moved, no one spoke. Father Rowan closed his eyes for a brief moment, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. The ceremony was over, but everything had changed. The heavy wooden doors of the church swung shut behind Elowen, leaving the room in silence. What had been exposed, what had been broken, would never be forgotten. The silence was thick, like the air had changed forever. No one spoke. No one knew what to say. Dorian stood frozen in place, his hands still clenched, his face unreadable. The guests sat in the church, each of them fidgeting in their seats, some looking anywhere but at Dorian. Some stared at the glowing candles in the alcoves or the delicate designs in the stained glass windows, pretending to be absorbed in the beauty around them, while others kept their eyes on him, waiting for a sign, a gesture, any kind of acknowledgement. They watched him like he held the weight of the moment in his hands, as if everything depended on him somehow. There were hushed whispers, voices low but unmistakable, rippling through the rows, filled with curiosity and intrigue, as though the whole situation had turned into something far more than a simple ceremony. Dorian didn't move. He felt like the eyes of the entire room were on him, but he couldn't bring himself to meet anyone's gaze. His hands trembled at his sides, the weight of the moment settling on his shoulders like an unspoken burden. It felt like everything had turned silent around him, but inside, his mind was racing, overwhelmed by the thoughts he couldn't push away. Silas, sitting with Vespera, exhaled softly through his nose. The sound was barely audible, but in the heavy stillness of the church, it seemed to echo. He adjusted the cuffs of his pristine suit with the kind of quiet care that suggested he was trying to maintain control over something, perhaps himself, perhaps the situation. But in that moment, it seemed like the only thing he was in control of was his outward appearance, and not the feelings that were surely swirling inside of him. He had won, he thought. Vespera, sitting calmly beside him, didn't look at Dorian. She didn't look at the door where Elowin had just exited either. She simply smoothed the fabric of her dress, clasped her hands in her lap, and settled into what seemed like an inevitable reality. Father Rowan, standing at the front of the church, watched them both, Silas, Vespera, and Dorian, his gaze moving between them. He had known Dorian for many years, watched him grow from a young boy into a man who had made a life for himself, far away from his parents' expectations. Father Rowan had seen the slow unraveling of their family dynamic, seen how the tension between Dorian and his parents had always simmered just beneath the surface. He had known, perhaps even before Dorian did, that this day might unfold like this. Not in this exact way, but in a way that was all too familiar. Father Rowan had seen it in their eyes long before today. He had known that, deep down, Silas and Vespera had always believed that, in the end, Dorian would come back to them. He would return, broken, and Elowin would be the one to walk away. They hadn't fought, hadn't raised their voices, or made a scene. No, they had been too sure of themselves, too certain that Dorian would come to his senses and realize that their world, their expectations, were what mattered most. They had always thought that love would be enough for Dorian, but that love had never been enough to overcome the weight of the choices he had to make. Now, as he looked at Dorian, Father Rowan saw the slow unraveling of a man who had been torn between two worlds, the world he had been raised in and the world he had built with Elowin. He had tried so hard to make them both fit together, to believe that love could bridge the gap between them, but the truth was that it hadn't worked. Not like he thought it would. Not like he wanted it to. Dorian stood frozen, his expression shifting as he finally realized something he had been avoiding for far too long. His hands, which had been stiff with tension, began to relax at his sides. His shoulders, too, slumped slightly, as though he was letting go of something he had been holding on to for years. It was a small movement, almost imperceptible, but it marked a change. He had been torn between his love for Elowin and the pressure from his family to let go of that love. But now, as he stood in the place where Elowin had once stood beside him, he saw the truth for what it was. She had left not because she didn't love him. No, Elowin had left because in that moment when she needed him most, he had hesitated. He had failed to choose her. He had let doubt seep in, had let his parents' disapproval make him falter, even if it was just for a second. And that second had been enough. Suddenly, without warning, Dorian moved. He didn't speak, didn't look at anyone as he turned and walked past the altar, past the rows of silent guests. He headed toward the doors, his pace quickening as though the weight of the decision he had made, or failed to make, was finally too much to bear. His mother's voice called out to him, sharp, firm, but he didn't stop. His father's voice followed, steady and commanding, but it didn't reach him either. Dorian didn't stop. Father Rowan, watching the scene unfold before him, didn't move to stop Dorian. He had known Dorian for so long, had watched him struggle with this very thing, and he knew that there were some lessons that couldn't be taught with words. Some lessons had to be learned the hard way. The doors of the church groaned as Dorian pushed them open and stepped outside. The cool afternoon air hit him like a wave, and for a moment he stood still, trying to shake off the suffocating feeling that had clung to him inside the church. Outside, the world seemed vast, open, and free. It was a sharp contrast to the confined, heavy air inside, where expectations weighed on him like a lead blanket. Elowin was nowhere in sight, and for a moment he simply stood there, his breath unsteady, his heart still racing. It wasn't supposed to happen like this, he thought. She wasn't supposed to leave him first. But now, standing outside, he realized that she had. She had left because, when the moment came, he hadn't been strong enough to make a choice. He had believed, foolishly, that love alone would be enough to bridge the gap between his family and Elowin. But it hadn't been. It wasn't just about love. It was about the choices he made. And in that moment, he had made the wrong one. The realization hit him like a punch in the gut. He had let his parents' doubt poison him. He had let their silence carry more weight than his love for Elowen. He had let their expectations overshadow what he truly wanted. And now, standing in the open air, he saw the truth. She had left because he hadn't been willing to fight for her. He hadn't chosen her when it mattered most. He couldn't let it end like this. He wouldn't let them be right. He had to find her. His feet moved before his thoughts could catch up. He walked quickly toward the parking lot, searching desperately for any sign of Elowen. His heart hammered in his chest, and his fingers fumbled with his phone as he tried to call her. But when he tried to dial her number, his fingers hesitated. What could he say? What words could undo what had already happened? How could he fix what he had broken? He couldn't. He knew that now. But he had to try. He stopped for a moment, his chest tight, feeling the weight of everything that had led to this. He remembered how Elowen had looked at him when she turned to leave. Not with anger, not with disappointment, but with a quiet, devastating understanding. She had given him the chance to prove he would stand beside her, and he had failed. He had hesitated, and now it was too late. Just as he was about to give up, he spotted a black car near the edge of the parking lot. The engine was running, and the car was just about to leave. Elowen was inside, her profile barely visible through the tinted windows. Without thinking, Dorian rushed toward the car, his heart pounding in his chest. The car was moving, but he reached it just in time, slapping his hand against the back window. It slowed, and the window began to roll down. Elowen's face appeared, calm and tired. She didn't look angry. She didn't look sad. She looked resigned. He could feel the weight of everything between them, and it made his throat tighten. He had no right to ask her to stay, no right to undo the hurt he had caused. But he had to try. "I was wrong," he said, his voice cracking slightly. "I was wrong to listen to them. I was wrong to hesitate. I was wrong to make you feel like I wasn't choosing you." Elowen raised a hand, stopping him. "You were scared," she said simply. Dorian was startled. She had known. She had known all along that he was scared, but that didn't make it okay. "No," he said, shaking his head. "That doesn't make it okay." She agreed. "No, it doesn't," she said softly. A heavy silence fell between them. Dorian felt the weight of her words settle in his chest. He had failed her, and now there was nothing he could do to fix it. "I love you," he said, his voice steady this time. "That never changed. I need you to know that." Elowen studied him for a moment. "I know you love me," she said quietly. "That was never the question." The words hit him like a punch. She was right. That had never been the question. The question had always been whether he was strong enough to love her the way she needed to be loved, whether he could stand by her, not just in the easy moments, but in the hard ones too. And in the moment that had mattered most, he hadn't been strong enough. "You waited for me to prove that I could fight for you," Dorian said, his voice low. "And I didn't." Elowen nodded faintly, not with anger, but with understanding. "You fought," she said softly, "just not hard enough." Dorian closed his eyes, feeling the sting of her words. She wasn't being cruel. She was simply telling the truth. She sighed, leaning back slightly in the seat, her gaze distant. "You always wanted to believe that your love for me and your love for them could coexist," she said. "But Dorian—" She looked at him then, and for the first time her voice wavered slightly. "Some things don't fit together. Some choices can't be shared." Dorian swallowed hard, knowing she was right. He had believed for so long that love alone could fix everything, but it couldn't. Not this time. "I know," he whispered, his voice barely audible. The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken words. Finally, Elowen opened the car door and stepped out, her white dress billowing slightly in the breeze. She reached for his hand, her touch light and gentle, and then she let go. The world seemed to stop as she turned away, walking toward the car. Without looking back, she climbed inside and the driver began to pull away. Dorian stood still, unable to move as he watched her car disappear into the distance. Inside the church, the guests had begun to leave, chatting softly amongst themselves, moving on from the scene that had unfolded so unexpectedly. But Dorian remained frozen, feeling the weight of his failure, feeling the weight of everything he had lost. His parents would be pleased, he thought bitterly. They had won. They had gotten what they wanted. Elowen would go on with her life, and he would have to find a way to move forward too. But he knew that nothing would ever be the same. Nothing would ever erase the memory of the moment he had failed her, the moment he had failed himself. Turning away from the church, Dorian walked into the world that now seemed so vast and empty, his steps echoing in the quiet. It was over. But it had always been over. Thanks for watching. If you liked the story, don't forget to subscribe, like, and share your thoughts in the comments. Check out our other videos too. See you in the next one.